Hey everyone, I'm Jonathan Sriranganathan. I'm the Greens candidate for Mayor of Brisbane, and we're a couple of weeks into the campaign now, so we thought we'd give you a bit of an update on how things are going. First off, we wanted to acknowledge country and pay respects to the Yagara and Turrbal people, recognising that sovereignty was never ceded and that the struggle for First Nations reparations and land rights needs to be at the centre of our political project, and we'll probably talk a bit more about that in future discussions. But right now, I wanted to introduce Aleesha, who's volunteering on the campaign and is going to ask me some questions, and we're going to reflect on how things are going and why we're doing this.
Yeah, it's great to be able to sit down with you, Jonno.
Thanks, mate. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, so I guess the first question that I have on my mind is wondering, why did you want to run for mayor?
Yeah, good question. A couple of reasons. One is sort of this idea of using the platform of the Mayoral Campaign to articulate more radical ideas and broaden the parameters of debate. So shifting the Overton window, that's kind of like the topics that are deemed as politically acceptable to debate and discuss. And a kind of example of that is a few years ago when I first got involved in local council politics, the idea of talking about rent controls was way off the table in Australian politics. The idea that you would even mention placing limits on how much rents can increase was seen as taboo or politically damaging. And through my time as a councillor and partnership with a lot of other people, we have shifted the conversation to the point where now, even at the national level, the Greens feel comfortable talking about rent controls and are actually winning votes over it. So that's one of the reasons for running, is to take ideas which were previously considered a little fringe or whatever and bring them into the mainstream. Another reason is kind of the more immediate goal of helping get more Greens councillors elected. So winning the mayoralty is probably a little bit of a long shot, but if I'm running as the mayoral candidate and using my profile to support other campaigns, that would help us win a bunch of seats across the city. And also, though, I'm really just interested in experimenting with different campaign tactics. And you and I have talked a little bit about this, about like how even progressive campaigns and Greens campaigns sometimes feel a little bit like a machine or really formulaic. And so we want to use this mayoral campaign to try and push against that a little bit, try some new ways of reaching people, and in particular to bring civil disobedience tactics into the campaign itself. So protest and activism is not something that happens in parallel to Greens politics, but that it's inextricably enmeshed with the Greens as an election campaign kind of project. And so, yeah, I guess we can talk more about that, but that's kind of another thing that really interests me about the mayoral campaign is like, oh, can we use the campaign to show residents of Brizzy that it's possible to engage in these forms of activism and to train people up to engage in different forms of protest, so that, yeah, there's like more capacity across the city to resist coercive state power and resist the destructive impacts of big businesses. It's like, can we use the campaign to grow the capacity of radical activism in Brizzy?
Yeah. Can you describe a little bit more of what radical activism looks like for the everyday person within Brisbane?
Yeah, good question. I think it looks like a lot of things. Like it's everything from guerrilla gardens and like local community art projects that might not completely ask permission before they go chalking on the footpath or whatever, through to more traditional forms of mutual aid and support, like putting on free food programs or setting up like a tool library and all that sort of stuff, through to more directly disruptive tactics. So things like blockading an eviction, or maybe there's a developer who's proposing to bulldoze a patch of native forest and cut down a bunch of trees, supporting residents to lock on and resist the destruction of that ecological area. And I guess it's also about showing allyship and support for other activist movements that are already out there. So, for example, the school strike for climate is coming up on the 15th of September, and I'm not personally involved in organising that, and that's being organised completely separate from the Greens as a political party, but we want to be encouraging our supporters and volunteers to get along to that and maybe provide different kinds of behind-the-scenes support if it's needed, rather than just leaving it up to school kids alone to organise that sort of stuff. But yeah, I think we're still working it out as we go along. We don't know exactly what this looks like yet. And as a campaign, I feel like you, me, the other volunteers are all really like, all right, let's see what happens. Let's see what people come up with, and let's be open to new ideas.
Totally. Which is the exciting thing about it, that it's experimental and emergent and generative and
Yeah, very DIY and like, yeah, open-ended. I mean, you're not a member of the Greens. There's lots of people getting involved who are not like party Greens members. Sort of, they're just people who are like interested in political transformation and how we shift systems and yeah, thinking deeply about how we challenge the status quo.
Yeah. Why do you think now's the time in which people are getting involved in local politics or the ways in which they can be more active citizens in their local communities? Why do you think now that the temperature shift has happened, particularly in the face of, existing within a changed climate?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know for sure that it has shifted in a big way. I think maybe a few more people are starting to pay more attention to the local, but it has been a bit of a struggle to get people to see the relevance of local council politics. And I think there have been times in the past where people have really oriented towards the local and talked a lot about bottom-up change. But then maybe for the past decade or so, it's felt like so many of our political conversations about how change happens seem to revolve around how do we put pressure on state and federal politicians. And maybe in a way the anarchist critique of, oh no, we need to organise in our local communities, we need to build stuff from the bottom up, has kind of been sidelined in favour of this preoccupation with change from above. And so I guess maybe now people who've spent a lot of time in those forms of activism of like, how do we sign petitions to convince the Prime Minister to listen to us, or how do we like organise a big rally to shift state government policy, are starting to realise that we still lack some of the capacity on the ground to build a depth of struggle. And so, yeah, this kind of like, there's more people have realized the weaknesses of those strategies and are now pivoting back towards, okay, how do we build up local capacity? I don't even know my neighbors' names. How can I correct that? Maybe it's a generational shift as well. Like, I think sometimes as activists get a little bit older or more experienced, they realize that the stuff that gets the media headline or gets a lot of clicks on social media isn't necessarily the only stuff that's politically valuable. And so doing that deeper grassroots community organizing work starts to become more important. And I guess the other thing I'd add to that is that there's an important difference between mobilizing and organizing. And even a lot of Greens campaigning, it's kind of about taking people who are already politically conscious and mobilizing them to go do a specific activity like door knocking or delivering flyers or whatever. But organising is also about raising people's consciousness and empowering them to lead and mobilise others. And that's what I think we need to keep doing more of. It's like we don't just want the same handful of people who are sending out emails and trying to mobilise a whole bunch of supporters to go off and do a thing. We want to be training up more people so that they can be organisers in their own networks, so that they can then empower others and build more of that ground up capacity.
Yeah, amazing. I think now's the time to probably ask is, what's the role of local government?
Yeah, really good question. Local government has a lot of power that people probably aren't aware of. And stop me if I'm ranting too much here because I get on a hobby horse about this. But like, if you think about, say, every now and then there's like a corruption scandal and the state or federal government has made some decision or changed some policy that has like millions of dollars worth of repercussions, like people's like property values change, or, you know, some business is losing millions of dollars as a result of whatever, or maybe the government has given a grant of like $5 million to some sports company. It's like outrageous. But those sorts of decisions happen at the local council level all the time. And very few people notice or pay attention. So as an example, like Brisbane City Council recently spent like $600 million widening Kingsford Smith Drive, the road out to the airport, widening it from like 4 lanes to 6 lanes. $600 million is a lot of money, right? And if the state government or the federal government was pushing a project like that, people would be asking more questions. They'd be looking closely at the business case. They'd be saying, oh, is this the best use of money? But at the council level, projects like that sometimes get a bit of a free pass. So yeah, the council is wielding a lot of money. The Brisbane City Council's local government budget is like $4.3 billion a year. But on top of the budget it spends directly, it also makes a lot of decisions that dramatically shift private property values. So for example, zoning, which is where the council sets rules around how land can be used. Can you build a house here? Can you build an apartment here? Can you use it for a workshop? Whatever. And when the council changes the zoning rules for some blocks of land, that changes the value of that land by millions of dollars. If you've got an old block of farmland and suddenly you rezone it to allow a developer to build housing there, whoever owns that block of farmland at the time is cashing in. They haven't even built anything, but suddenly their land is worth way more money. So the council's making decisions like that all the time that have really big economic ramifications. And so, yeah, I think it's important to pay attention to that and to understand that actually that's really fertile ground for corruption and sort of disempowerment of the community. But another reason that local government is important is that if we are trying to change these political systems, we need to rebuild or reconfigure or reimagine democracy from the bottom up. And I think that means, starting at the local government level and developing different processes and systems and cultures of how people can participate in democracy. Because I love the idea of saying to people, hey, let's all go out and have a vote on how the federal budget should be allocated. But actually, most people are so politically disengaged and are so out of practice of making those democratic decisions that I don't even know how well that would work. And so I think it's an opportunity to start at the local level and get people used to different forms of democratic engagement. And the other little thing I'd say about, there's lots of reasons I think local government's important, but the other thing I'd say is it's local government has the capacity to do a lot of community development work to build up local capacity. So the stuff we're talking about doing in our campaign on a really small level, the council could be doing at a citywide level and setting up tool libraries and food cooperatives and housing cooperatives and alternative transport systems that reduce dependence on the private sector and multinational corporations, but that also kind of reduce the dependence on big centralized government. We're not just trying to, empower people to not be stuck on Coles and Woolies. We also kind of want communities to be more self-sufficient and autonomous rather than, having to be at the beck and call of state and federal governments. So I think councils can play a bigger role there in decentralizing and localizing the means of production and essential services so that communities have more control over the things they need to live a good life.
Absolutely. So hearing that and talking about, the state and federal government, so what's the difference between local, state and federal, but specifically in the context of the Greens?
So for those who don't know, we have 3 levels of government in Australia, and we have a constitution that kind of sets out some delineation of responsibilities between state and federal governments. And so, federal government has control, more direct control over things like immigration policy and the military. And traditionally, states are seen as having more control over stuff like education and healthcare, although there's a lot of blur in there. And most of the money comes through the federal government. So although the states are theoretically in control, the funding comes via federal taxation. But then the local government is sort of this separate creature that often it's really kind of a subsidiary of the state government in a way that the state government can often come in over the top and overrule things that local council does. But really local government is responsible for the shape of our communities and how things on the ground are managed and administered on a day-to-day basis. So it's all the stuff that people would be familiar with, like repairing potholes and laying footpaths and collecting rubbish from the wheelie bins. But it's also a much broader range of responsibilities in terms of culture. And so, the council puts money into certain events or festivals or activities and doesn't fund other stuff. And those decisions have cultural and political ramifications across the city. And the council also plays a really big role in kind of being the mouthpiece or the sort of the platform for the city to articulate what it wants from high levels of government. So when state and federal governments are trying to work out what do Brisbane residents want, they don't actually survey everyone in Brisbane. They just kind of go to the council and say, hey, you're the council, what do the people in your city want? So there's actually a little bit of a breakdown of democracy there where we vote for our state and federal politicians and we hope they're going to listen to us. But often they actually listen more to the councils in those particular areas. And so that's part of why we see, in some areas of regional Queensland, you've got local councils advocating really strongly for the mining industry and saying we need more coal mines opened up. And then state and federal governments are listening to those council administrations rather than actually listening to the people who live in those communities. And of course, the councils themselves have been manipulated or influenced by the corporate sector. So there's a real fertile ground there for corruption and bad decision making. But maybe that's another conversation.
Totally. So but following up then, so how does then, in terms of the Greens party, play out within local, state and federal?
Yeah, so the Greens run candidates at all levels of government. And there are some parts of the country where we don't necessarily run branded Greens candidates at the local level. But in Brisbane City Council, it's pretty common for parties to run as political parties at the local government level. So the Greens in Brisbane, we hold 2 state seats. We hold the state seats of Mayoral and South Brisbane. Mayoral is kind of like the inner western suburbs, and South Brisbane, pretty self-explanatory. And then we've recently won 3 federal seats. We've won the seats of Brisbane, which is kind of the inner north, and then Ryan, which is the inner western suburbs going right out to Pullen Vale and the Gap, so not really inner city at all. And then the seat of Griffith, which is most of the inner south side. And so we've won those seats at the state and federal levels. And so we've got a couple of representatives in the state parliament, a couple of representatives at the federal parliament. But then in Brisbane, we only have 1 council ward. We've got the ward of the Gabba ward, and there are 26 wards in Brisbane, and most of them are controlled by the Liberal National Party. So with the council election coming up in March next year, we're now running for, to hopefully win quite a few more wards. And I guess one thing that's important to point out is that although we've won those seats at the state and federal level, the resources that come with winning a seat, like suddenly Max Chandler Mather, who's our federal MP for Griffith, he now has an office and he has 4 staff and he has a bit of an office budget. But you're not allowed to use any of that money for election campaigning for the Greens, and rightly so. But some people might be like, oh, well, the Greens, aren't they a big party? Don't they have a lot of money now? Kind of no. Like, it's the council campaign, or at least our mayoral campaign, is still all volunteers, and we're hopefully fundraising enough money to be able to pay like 1 or 2 people part-time to help organise the rest of the volunteers. But although the Greens might seem like this big political party, it's pretty much all volunteer run. The party itself only has 3 or 4 permanent staff in the entire state of Queensland. So for us at the local council level, we're basically trying to organise lots of volunteers to win more seats, hopefully win plenty of seats off the Liberal Party, who currently control the council, and knock the Liberals out of majority so that then the Greens have a bit more influence over decision making.
Yeah. And like hearing that, it makes me think, or it makes me wonder, like, what do you see, what are the things that you wish people understood about you in running for the Mayor of Brisbane?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like there's obviously certain caricatures of me that are circulated by like the conservative corporate media or our political opponents. And I mean, I would say, oh, look, those things are stupid, don't listen to them. But I think also sometimes they're right when they say that I am a little bit radical. Like even within the context of the Australian Greens, I'm probably more willing to argue for deeper transformation and bigger systemic change as opposed to incremental reforms. There are some people in the Greens who are very progressive and we all want to get to the same place, but they might take an approach of, oh, we have to make really small minor changes. We don't want to piss anyone off. We don't want to paint a big target on our backs. Whereas my approach to politics has been like, no, look, let's just be honest and say what we really stand for. And if people attack us for it, then fair enough. And I think sometimes people might look at that and be like, oh, Jonno's being a little bit unstrategic here. He just said the thing and now he's inviting all this criticism. But actually, my political strategy has been about being willing to say stuff that might be seen as a little bit provocative or controversial or whatever. And that gets more people talking and generates more discussion, and in so doing helps shift the parameters of debate, like we talked about earlier. Like, my goal is not necessarily to make everyone love me straight away and win over lots of people to vote in the Greens. It's about injecting ideas out there and building consensus for those ideas. But I guess I would emphasize that although there's often a lot of media coverage of me like engaging in protests or supporting different kinds of activism, I'm usually doing that as a last resort. That's after we've tried the submissions and the letter writing and different forms of negotiation and diplomatic advocacy. And for the 7 years that I was working as a city councillor, that was how I got most of my like practical outcomes, was like working across party lines, negotiating diplomatically with public servants or even with Labor or LNP councillors. But most members of the public wouldn't see all that work. They'd just see the sort of 30-second news grab of me at a protest. So I guess I'd like people to understand that there's more to me than just that sort of public image of the colourful activist. Like, I do have professional background. I've got a law degree and all that sort of stuff. Like, on paper, I'm actually quite a sort of conservative or traditional politician in some ways. Like, but I think it's very easy to misrepresent or characterize me in a certain way, but that's probably just a narrow sliver of who I am and how I approach the work.
Totally. Jonno, what excites you about the future? Can you paint me the picture
Ooh.
of how you envision the future of Brisbane?
Yeah, really good question. And I should preface this by saying that this is my vision, but it should be up to all of us to co-create these visions and decide what do you think is important. It shouldn't just be up to me as one person to say, here's how Brisbane should change. But since you asked, my personal vision, and I think it's a vision that a lot of people sort of share, is for a city that's much more focused on sustainability and equality and community support. So rather than kind of the dominant norm at the moment where we're like, oh, if someone's poor or if someone's homeless, the system kind of tells them, oh, it's your own fault, you didn't work hard enough or whatever. I think we should be pushing towards a society where we support people who are struggling, and we recognize that often the reasons people are struggling are systemic. It's not just because they've made bad individual choices. It's because the system hasn't given them good choices to choose between. And so kind of in a material sense, what that looks like is much bigger emphasis on housing justice, so that the city and all levels of government take more response for housing people rather than leaving housing right up to the private for-profit sector. So that might mean building more medium density public housing throughout the city, not just in one or two places, but high quality homes that are owned either by the government or by a non-profit community housing org that are rented out cheaply and that everyone can afford to live in, so that people don't have to choose between getting rent gouged by a private landlord and homelessness, so that there are other options out there. The vision for the city also looks like reconnecting wildlife corridors and greening our streets and public spaces. So we do have some really nice big parks, but often it's just bare lawn. There's no habitat there. So, kind of bringing a bit of a urban forest or urban jungle vibe back to the city. And yeah, that's one thing that Brisbane already has a bit of, is an amazing richness of biodiversity and lots of wildlife that's still within the urban footprint. And so I'd like to sort of strengthen that and restore habitats. And then that's one piece of the puzzle. And then there's thinking about transport, and all these things interlink, right? If you have housing located in the right places close to where people are trying to get to, then it's easier to build sustainable transport systems. And if you have sustainable transport systems, then you're not cutting down as many trees to widen roads. But in transport in particular, I imagine a bigger focus on walkable neighbourhoods and streets for people, so that our roads aren't just dominated by cars, that there's safe separated lanes for bicycles, and that the footpaths are broad enough and accessible for people with impaired mobility, and that it's easy to cross the road to get to the bus stop, and the bus actually shows up, and we have high frequency public transport that's ideally free. So you're not just paying $5 one way to get in and out of the city, that you also have options to catch a local free bus to get you a couple of suburbs over, and that we decentralize our transport network so that it's not all about moving workers in and out of the city centre, which is kind of how it is at the moment. So I guess that's a bit of a snapshot. I could go all day about this stuff. I imagine a flourishing of local festivals and music in the suburbs, and I imagine a stronger emphasis on local community sport rather than just all the money going into stadium upgrades and the Olympics and that sort of stuff. But yeah, like I said, I think really it's about what do other people want and how can we co-create this vision rather than one or two people deciding it from the top down.
Yeah, amazing. Not only does that sound desirable, it sounds reasonable.
Thanks.
Thanks for
you would say that though. Yeah. You're a volunteer on my campaign.
No, but very generally as
Thanks.
well. So, Jonno, how do you feel the campaign's been going so far?
Yeah, good. I've been really encouraged by when we announced a couple of weeks ago, there was lots of supportive comments and lots of people signing up to volunteer and be oh, this is great. And yeah, that really energizes me. Hearing that people are supportive makes me feel it's worthwhile, because I'm volunteering my time in this role. I'm not getting paid to be a candidate. So I'm kind of putting the rest of my life on hold for 6 months to run for office, partly because I would like to win and become the mayor, but partly also just to help other people get elected and do all that other stuff we've already talked about. But yeah, so the energy and the response from the community has been really positive and encouraging. I've been blown away by how many people have signed up to volunteer. I think we've hit 160 or 170 volunteer signups now, which is amazing. And I I think what we're still grappling with and navigating is how do we take all that volunteer energy and direct it in a way that's productive and efficient and where we're using people's time in a valuable, worthwhile way rather than like everyone signs up to volunteer and they come to the campaign with all these special skills, but we just ask them to go deliver letters. And delivering letters is very important. Like it's important to get our message out there in people's letterboxes, but there's other ways that people should be able to contribute to the campaign. And so I think we're still working through, okay, what do the structures look like? How can we have different working groups, like working on events or working on volunteer management or working on admin and working on like direct action stuff? And how do those all fit together? And how do we do it in a way where I'm not just this one bottleneck? Because often what happens in campaigning and like you're volunteering a bit with the social media team, and like this is definitely a challenge we've got, right? Is like there might be lots of people who can produce content or like take photos or put videos together, but they're kind of, all that content is sort of going out with my name on it. And ideally, I want to know what's going out with my name on it. I want to know what I'm like saying to the public. So for the last sort of 7 years as a city councillor, I've been doing most of my social media myself, but I can't do that and run a whole citywide campaign at the same time. So we're trying to set up structures that allow volunteers to produce content and generate ideas without then having to wait like a week for me to get round and okay something before it goes up online. And I think that's an interesting challenge that's there for like content production and social media and messaging, but it's also there in terms of event organizing. Like if someone wants to put on a street party or like run a direct action training or something, ideally they should be able to start doing that without waiting for me as an individual to be like, yes, I give you my permission kind of thing. So we have to find ways that our volunteers can be trained and empowered to lead and organize stuff themselves. And then I can show up and support or like resource it or whatever, but without me having to be at the center of everything. And that's a challenge with lots of different kinds of community organizing, community campaigning. Almost inevitably, you get stuck with one or two people who are like the key decision makers and everyone else is like waiting for them to make a decision. And it's not always very democratic and it's not always very efficient. So yeah, it's like, how can we create a mass movement where lots and lots of people actually have agency and autonomy to do cool stuff as part of this mayoral campaign, even though it's kind of got my face on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
So that'll be, I guess, a fun experiment over the next 6 months.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jonno.
Cool. Thanks for listening, everyone.